pictures so ancient they were in black and white. These precious tokens of the past had barely escaped a century of disruption, and they might constitute someone's only inheritance from before the retribution. Others had no photographs, but some carried imaginative portraits or simple sketches they had made of an ancestor. Some, like Phoebe, carried an object. This might be a gun, or a quilt, or a cross-stitch, and she noticed a few others with stuffed animals. Around the necks of some hung the metal tags of soldiers who fought in wars more than a century ago. She even saw one man reverently carrying a pair of black leather boots before him. Soldiers' boots, too precious for him to wear them out. These people did not smile, but neither did they grieve. Rather, everyone was concentrating so much on being the person whose name they bore, that it truly seemed that they were these people. Phoebe saw a woman on their street call out to a man, addressing him not by his own name, but by the name of his ancestor, and the two of them joined hands as they walked along. Although she knew these two were not married, their ancestors had been, perhaps many generations before. Now once again as a couple they walked, hand in hand. Phoebe and Edelston entered the pit and crossed it, past the hall of men with the stone proclaiming Tyr's sacrifice. Then they began the walk down the Slavic, nearly a mile in length. Halfway down, she saw something that made her heart stop. A woman stepped out of her cabin and came down to the road. Phoebe looked at the photograph she carried, and with a shock saw the same photograph that she herself held in her hand. The woman's necklace spelled out Eleanor. Phoebe stood, transfixed. Those behind her, not expecting this halt, jostled her accidentally, causing her to drop the teddy bear. The woman with the photograph, seeing this, picked up the bear. Handing it to Phoebe, she looked at her necklace and addressed her by her grandmother's name. "You dropped your little bear, Alice." Phoebe, recovering after a moment, assumed her part and addressed the woman. "Thank you, Eleanor." With a smile, the woman turned and walked down the lane. Phoebe stood there, a piece of flotsam borne across a century of forgetting. She had the eerie sense that all this had played out once before, and would play out again and again. Edelston asked if she were all right. Gathering herself, she resumed their walk, her skin covered in goosebumps from the encounter. Beyond the gate, they followed a route well trod by the farmers and lumberjacks, a path that led past orchard-covered hills. About a mile out, before they came to the forest, a path branched off to a series of low hills, and they took it. Before long, the procession passed by a mound. At its base stood a massive memorial stone bearing this inscription: "To the dead of Bear Garth." Hundreds of names were listed there, row upon row, as well as this poem: "Where has the horse gone? Where the rider? Where the giver of treasure? Where the seats at the feast? Where is the joy in the hall? Alas for the bright cup! Alas for the armored warrior! Alas for the chieftain's glory! How that time has passed away, grown dark under shadow of night, as if it never was." 43. It had the ring of an ancient poem, like the one Edelston had recited at the high seat. The lines touched upon that fear that had haunted their race from the beginning, the fear of forgetting. All things change and pass away, she reflected, but remembrance keeps them alive. This is the bond between the living and the dead. Brigid and Connor were by the stone, and although Phoebe could not see what names they wore, it was clear that both the living and the dead had been touched by the fall of Bear Garth. Connor was leaning forward, his hand upon the names engraved upon the stone, his head down in grief. For just an instant, Phoebe thought she saw other hands pressed to his, but from the inside of the stone, palm to palm, and just as quickly the image vanished. Brigid was kneeling down, her dress fanned out about her, her head lowered, and Phoebe heard her quietly sobbing. She walked past, leaving husband and wife to a sorrow only they could know. Further on, they came to a gently sloping low hill, and on it were many stones like the ones she had seen at the Field of Tears. At first they seemed to be randomly placed, but as she and Edelston ascended the slope, she saw that here, too, they were placed in the oblong outline of ships. The procession had broken up, as people headed for one or another of these outcroppings. These, Edelston explained, were burial sites, and each clan had one. Wolfgarth had been founded by around 50 families, to include those individuals who married shortly thereafter and began families. Each of these clans had at least one burial site, here or on a neighboring hill, where they would gather round, speaking to the dead and making offerings to their spirits. Edelston led her off to the far side of the hill, where a single stone stood by itself. Its message read, Leonidas, son of Imre Hegemagas, Hungary, 2052 Wolfgarth, 2101. It occurred to her that Leonidas could have been only 20 when his wife died, and Nausicaa might have been no older than Phoebe herself. For 3 decades he had kept his wife's memory, and that of the child they would have had. Then he was cut down in the attempt to rescue another woman and her child. Phoebe understood what that must have meant to him, a chance to redeem his absence 30 years earlier. My wife is buried in Bear Garth, Edelston said, and she realized he was speaking as Leonidas, speaking as father once had to son. Phoebe spoke, but not as herself. From out of the flames of the red crematoriums she spoke, an old woman who had once known life before the retribution. Not for my daughter and granddaughter, I would have taken my own life. You did well to stay, Leonidas told her. We cannot know in advance what impact our actions will have. But now you know what a difference you made. You have a granddaughter you can be proud of. After my bride was killed, he went on, I, too, wanted to die. Nothing I could do would bring her back. I felt her death like a mortal wound, and I was waiting for the world to finish me off. Then one day I was reading a book, Xenophon it was, about an army that was in despair, surrounded, ready to die. Xenophon spoke with his fellow junior officers, for all their generals had been killed. He said they had to change the mindset of the soldiers, so instead of thinking what is going to happen to me, they would think what action am I going to take. Those words leapt off the page and grabbed me. I could choose to not be a victim. That is when I decided to become a scavenger. 44. I'm glad you did, said Alice. You saved many people, and you handed down that legacy to your son. If you hadn't done that, Mephibes wouldn't be alive. Leonidas took her hand then, a courtly gesture to the old woman, and together they looked at the stone in silence. Later, they made their way to a neighboring hill, where all the folk of Wolfgarth were gathering. A flat rock lay at the top, and next to it stood a man. She noticed that everyone had gathered by clan along the sides of the hill. Some clans were large, with 60 members or more, others comprised just a few families. Edelston belonged to the same clan as Connor and Brigid, Raven clan. After the destruction of Bear Garth, Leonidas, its sole surviving adult male, had been deliberately assigned to the same clan into which Connor was adopted, to serve as a mentor to the young bear. Everyone faced the top of the hill, but in the center of each clan stood a man like the one at the top, wearing a pendant from which hung a small hammer, a symbol of the mighty weapon by which Thor held back the forces of chaos. Their own clan leader, a lumberjack in late middle age, Phoebe knew to be Connor's uncle, younger brother of the man who had adopted the orphan. When all were ready, the solemn rites began. The man at the top spoke out so that all could hear. He hallowed the space and called upon those assembled to hearken to the ceremony. He spoke of the turning of the season, the withering of plants, the darkening of the sky. As winter approached, they must draw strength from their ancestors, who even now reached out to them from across the worlds. To those ancestors, also, he addressed himself, to join their descendants in this solemn rite, the blot. Then he filled a drinking horn and raised it to the sky. To our ancestors, who guarded our line and even now guide us. Each clan leader raised his own horn, then each took a drink. The horn of each clan was passed around, and everyone toasted his kin who had gone before. Phoebe, too, made the toast, tasting the honey-sweet mead. Each clan leader then poured the remnants of the horn into a bowl. As each raised the bowl to the sky, the Garth leader did likewise, declaring it to be made sacred by the words and deeds of the clan. Using a sprig from a tree, each clan leader then sprinkled the members of the clan with the contents of the bowl. Afterwards, the Garth leader raised the bowl once more, and called upon the ancestors of Wolf Garth to accept it as an offering from the living. Hail the ancestors, he boomed, and when the folk repeated it, the hills about them rang with the echo. Hail the gods. Again the voices resounded. Hail the folk. And once more they cried out. Then, in unison, each clan leader poured the rest of the bowl's contents into the ground. From the gods to the earth to us, now from us to the earth to the gods. A gift for a gift. 45 Afterwards, the Garth leader declared the rite ended, calling upon all those present to remember that their strength came from their ancestors and the gods. For the gods, too, Phoebe recalled, are our ancestors. After the communion with the dead, each family made its way in silent contemplation back toward the Garth. Their ancestors were in their hearts now, and the living carried their things back to their cabins, the block necklaces and treasured items from the past. When she and Edelston had returned to their home, he explained that the rite they had just conducted, the blot, which sounded like bloat, was an ancient form of sacrifice that had been practiced, with many variations, throughout pre-Christian Europe. Sacrifice. For Phoebe, the word conjured up Old Testament scenes of pagans bowing down before strange gods, hoping to buy their favor or avert their anger. Her mind then lit upon a cross, where the divine Son was sacrificed to atone for the sins of all. Edelston, as if following the twists and turns of her imaginings, said, wherever our folk wandered through the ages, they encountered people who bowed down before their gods or God. But our elder kin demand no such submission. They ask only for our respect and cooperation. We are bound not only by kinship, but in friendship. As you and I do with Brigid and Connor, we share food and exchange gifts. As for the gods, we have already received their gifts. The food on our table, the fruitfulness of the soil, the warmth of the sun, the rain on our fields. Above all, we have received the gift of life, in a line that stretches back to Ask and Embla, who received those other gifts, those which make us what we are. We give back by pledging to the gods our might and main, and when we sacrifice, we make that offering sacred. 46 preparations for the winter night's feast were soon underway, and that evening, each family made its way to its clan hall. As Phoebe and Edelston entered the Hall of the Ravens, situated not far from their home on the other side of the Celtic, she was met by the sight of clan standards hanging from the rafters, family shields and tapestries on the walls, gleaming weapons hanging from hooks, and a great hearth fire. The tables and benches were being slowly filled up by the members of the clan, and Edelston found them seats near Brigid and Connor. Phoebe could see that now was a time for merriment and togetherness, as extended families gathered for a fall feast. It seemed that the spirits of the dead still hovered around, rejoicing in those now grown to adulthood and in the frolics of the children. When all had arrived, the littlest ones went outside for autumn games, and to watch as bonfires were lit, and they were watched by members of other clans, whose own festivities were later in the evening. Inside, their parents prepared to celebrate a rite called Sumbul, which the older children were able to watch if they wished. Sumbul, Edelston explained, was one of the oldest forms of religious communion for the peoples of Europe. As practiced in the Garth, it consisted of a series of ritual toasts around a common theme. It could be mothers, fathers, heroes, or ancestors. The winter night's Sumbul was naturally focused on ancestors. But there was a looseness here, a more relaxed posture compared to the more formal ceremony Phoebe had witnessed on the mound. This was also a more intimate affair, with only about 24 people present. 47, the clan leader's older sister, old enough to have been one of the founders, was the clan mother and hostess for this occasion. Bringing out the mead that she had spoken words of power over, she handed the ornate goblet to her brother, who received it reverently. He addressed Odin as the master of mead and inspiration, and his words came out as poetry. When he handed her back the goblet, she began to move inside the U-shape formed by the tables. This first toast, what they called the Cup of Honor, was made to the gods. Each man and woman, upon receiving the chalice, stood up and toasted a god or goddess. This was more than a thanksgiving, Ethelstan said. It was an invitation to that deity to invest some of his or her power in the one making the toast. Some toasts were simple. Hail Iduna, one person said. Others gave thanks for something in their life where they felt the help of the holy powers. After each toast, everyone else echoed the end of the toast and took a drink from their own cup, and so the toasts went round. When it came time for Ethelstan, he toasted Freya, thanking her for guiding him to Phoebe. It was then Phoebe's turn, and she stood up. Names of gods and goddesses that had been spoken here tonight flashed through her mind, but Phoebe knew it would be the one who had appeared to her in the ironwood. I also thank Freya, for bringing Ethelstan to me. Hail Freya, she had been nervous at first, but now she felt a warmth that could only be Frith. As she looked around as the toasting went on, she realized that the gods and goddesses themselves must summon, their every feast a kind of ritual. She felt their power, felt it coursing to her and through her, as it flowed through everyone present, a closed circuit running back to the source. When all had finished, a second toast went up, the cup of remembrance. This one was dedicated by each person to an ancestor, as was appropriate on this day. Now it was their power which was invoked and called upon. When it came time for Phoebe, she toasted her own father, the one who had laughed with her, carried her on his back, and made her feel like the most special girl in the world. She spoke to him through the veil, and felt a rush of energy, as if her voice had caused it to lift momentarily. Then came the third and final round, the cup of Bragi, the god of poetry and eloquence. Here, there was even greater leeway for individual choice, for one could either draw upon the past or send out power and will into what may be. Some chose a boast, something they had resolved to do. The words, I will, spoken before the assembled clan, held great weight. Some spoke a brag, that is, something they had achieved, told with honest and well-deserved pride in the deed accomplished. A few made an oath, prefaced by the words, I vow. This, if fulfilled, would be a great addition to their own spiritual power and the collective might of the clan, but it was reserved for only the most serious of commitments. Such words bound one's character and traveled across the worlds, to be heard at the council of the gods. But an oath that was not kept could diminish one's power as well as one's standing in the Garth. Still others, including Phoebe, simply expressed a hope for the future, not binding themselves, but still participating and benefiting from the clan's might. Yet when she said, I hope to see better, only Brigid and Ethelstan knew that it was a spiritual sight she aimed at. One man recited a poem. Phoebe recognized him, for he lived only a few houses down from them. He was a cooper by trade, a maker of barrels and buckets, kegs and casks, tools of wood and iron. She also knew him to be a crack shot with the bow, for Connor had mentioned him as an instructor in the trials. Silverlock they called him, for he had a shock of white in his otherwise dark hair. He had been working on this poem, he said, since the time of the last winter nights, and this was the fulfillment of that boast. It was a gift to the children of Raven clan, and Phoebe saw many of them here, old enough to understand the words. In the time of the Goths, a girl walked the shore of Baltic waters, heard the sea's wild roar, saw sunlight on waves, the plunge of ships' oar, felt sand underfoot, found shells to adore. Magic day, magic summer, a world to explore, to find words for such beauty, this task she swore. What she captured in verse, that always remains, her blood, blood of poets, it runs in your veins. A Celtic man stood in a green Gallic field, flanked by his kinfolk, with long sword and shield, facing the Romans, who demanded they yield. Others had surrendered, willingly they kneeled, but these were free men, their battle cry revealed. As the Celts' numbers dwindled, their fate was sealed. Yet still he swung on, refusing slaves' chains. His blood, blood of heroes, it runs in your veins. A maiden of Germany loved a knight on a quest, a heart-sewn cloth she gave him, and one last caress, for Jerusalem he departed, a crusade for the West. At the gates of that city, an arrow pierced his chest, but with her dear cloth to his wound tight pressed, he survived the fight, by her love most blessed. To her he returned, a bond stronger than chains, their blood, blood of lovers, it runs in your veins. Man and woman of Era gather their children, round to bury their littlest one in an ancient mound. With tears they left famine and a barren ground and boarded a ship for America bound. Westward they trekked, fertile land they found, all their hard toil with prosperity crowned. Cherishing simple joys, enduring their pains, their blood, blood of settlers, it runs in your veins. These the men, these the women, who the odds defied, the mailed warrior, the veiled bride, 1,000 generations to you are tied, the mind, heart, and body by which you are supplied, their deeds your inspiration, their spirit your guide. Never think you are alone, they stand by your side. The bow, the origin, gives the arrow its force, the fletching, tradition, guides the arrow's long course, the shaft, the unbroken line by which it soars, but the sharp point that finally strikes, that is yours. This poem affected Phoebe almost as deeply as had Ethelstan's. She had always known that the English language could be beautiful, the King James and her grandmother's book of poetry were proof of that. But all that had been written centuries before the Retribution. Many Apples was divided into language ghettos of Spanish, Chinese, Arabic, Hmong, Tagalog, Somali, Vietnamese, and dozens of other languages. In such a state of affairs, English belonged to everyone, and thus it truly belonged to no one. The language of Milton and Shakespeare had come to resemble a public toilet. One used it for a purpose, but no one would ever think of it as beautiful. But here, far from the city and its babble of tongues, the English language had regained a place of affection and respect in the hearts of its speakers. More concrete gifts were also given at Sumble. One young man of the Ravens had just returned from his trials. His father spoke of how proud he was of his son, then ceremonially presented him with a spear. His mother presented him with a shield. Then she spoke those words every young man longed to hear from his mother, for it cut the last tie to the days of boyhood, of the cub in the yard, with this shield or upon it. 48 By the close of the third round, Phoebe felt a gentle glow, the mead making for a cheery feeling of togetherness. Ethelstan told her that in ancient times, many of the Indo-European peoples would debate an important decision while drinking, when they could speak their minds freely, then later return to the same matter while sober, when logic could have its say. If, when governed by reason, they agreed with the decision they had made when tongues were free, then the decision would stand. The clan leader took the goblet and concluded the sumble with thanks to the gods, to the clan's ancestors, and to the spirits of the land, the whites of field and forest, rock and stream. Now it was time for the feast. Warm bread, marbled cheese, sweet ham, blueberry fritters, and other delicacies. Winter Nights was the final festival of harvest, after one that occurred in early August and another in late September, at the time of the autumn equinox. Food would not be on this lavish a scale until Yule. When they had put aside the desire for food and drink, they listened to music. A middle-aged man played guitar, while a young woman joined him on fiddle. Two of the songs described events long ago in Texas, a great battle almost 3 centuries before, the siege of a lone fort. Its defenders, like those of Bear Garth, had perished to a man. The first was the Ballad of the Alamo, with its roll call of heroes. The second was the death of Bowie Gizzardsbane, the story of the valiant Jim Bowie, with its stately opening. Harsh that hearing for Houston the Raven. 49 Edelston told her that their clan maintained a strong connection to what had once been called the Lone Star State, before whites there were overrun. He nodded at their aged clan mother, sitting in a place of honor, her hair a beautiful mix of gray and the raven black of her youth. She is the oldest daughter of the man who founded this clan. The family all these people are descended from came to Wolf Garth from Texas. Some say our founder named it Raven Clan after her mother, who had the same hair, while others say it was in honor of Houston the Raven. Phoebe looked more closely at the tapestries on the walls, which the women of the clan had added to over the course of a half-century. Depicted there were those early events from Texas history as well the retribution. Here was the family's move from Texas during the darkening, with the dark-haired mother and her daughter clearly discernible. Over there was the founding of the Garth, when the current clan leader was only 5. Visible here, amidst this peace and plenty, were their struggles during the hunger, and over there, Phoebe could see the arrival of Leonidas after the fall of Bear Garth, his one eye clearly identifying him. Later, Phoebe and Edelston made their way out to the bonfires, where the little children, those not yet old enough for the grown-up festivities, had had a feast of their own. Older members of other clans were entertaining them with stories and songs, and folk from all over the Garth walked here and there, exchanging greetings. She stopped to listen to a man singing about the rider and events at Bear Garth. The tune reminded her of the Ballad of the Alamo. In the ironwood of Mike Hagan there's a horseman riding on, and he's bearing news of Bear Garth, of a world that's come undone. As he rides across the UP in the warm sunlight of June, to his rear the fires are burning so he heads for Fair O.U. Tune. As the Boers swing the gate wide, and they help the rider down, they can see his blood-stained garments, as he stumbles to the ground. If you listen to his voice now, you can hear his urgent plea, as he whispers Bear Garth's ruin near the tower by the sea. So the Boers call for horses, then they mount with gun and sword. Aged fathers, sons, and brothers ride to face the lion horde. And the jackal's mood is somber as the portal opens wide. Each man's mother, daughter, sister no more has him by her side. Now the rider guides their journey, through the day and gloom of night, yet as Bear Garth's tower looms up, then he vanishes from sight. But the Boers' trek continues, and the host rides through the breach. As the jackals slay the lions, not a man escapes their reach. See the bears avenged with slaughter, that grim work until the night. Then the Boers take the fallen and perform the funeral rite. Next the victors go to Troll Bridge, and erect a bear of skulls, and a massive sign most bloody, a grim warning to the trolls. On the northern sea of folk lived, the white tower there still stands. You can hear the lonely trees sigh, see the work of long dead hands. So we honor Bear Garth's fallen, and we vow to never rest. For the dead cry out in judgment, should the living fail the test. In the ironwood of Mike Hagan there's a horseman riding on, and he's bearing news of Bear Garth, of a world that's come undone. Phoebe noticed Tara sitting on a log next to a little boy, and went over to join them. Tara was telling him all about Liam and his trials, and though the boy was still a toddler, he appeared to be listening attentively. Connor and Brigid emerged from the clan hall and called to their children. Tara promptly said goodbye to her playmate and ran off. Her father swept her up in his arms, and from atop his shoulders, she looked at Phoebe and smiled. Phoebe turned back to find the boy walking toward the fire. Before she could cry out, he was in the fire, yet still walking. All at once he disappeared in a puff of sparks that rose up to the night sky and its canopy of stars. Astonished, she turned to see if anyone else had seen it, but discovered that no one but Tara had seemed to notice. The girl, her face content, nodded to Phoebe. The veil had lifted. Chapter 8. Women's Work. Edmund Blair Layton, Stitching the Standard. Public domain. No finer, greater gift in the world than that, when man and woman possess their home, two minds, two hearts that work as one. Despair to their enemies, a joy to all their friends. Their own best claim to glory. Homer, The Odyssey. 50. The trees stood out starkly by the first week of November. Only the evergreens lent any color to the drabness of earth and sky that marks the gloomy transition between fall and winter. Then, in the second week, the first big snow came, blanketing the ground and depositing big white heaps on the evergreen boughs. But to the branches of the leaf-bereft trees, it imparted all the fineness and definition of human hair. The craggy line of the Drakensberg that extended,